Already.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Copper Queen Library virtual programs, and joining us, Mike Anderson, and UFOs, a scientific study. And I'm just really thrilled to have Mike as not just a patron and a community member who does so much good work in the community, but also as a historian and an author. Mike wrote a wonderful book on the Warren Ballpark, which we do have at the library available for checkout. And Mike's cat is joining us too tonight as well. His cat, which is also a mustache. And so we are just thrilled to have you, Mike, especially on this presentation, which has a new take and a new position from our United States government. So welcome, everybody, and take it away, Mike.
Thank you. Thanks for the folks that have signed on for this tonight. And I just want to give a little bit of an introduction as far as why I'm doing this and how this became a topic of interest for me. In January 1997, I took a trip to Phoenix to visit the Arizona Department of Education. I had to take care of some business up there to get my teaching license renewed. And I drove up there after dark on Interstate 10. So it was after 6 p.m. in January. And as I'm driving up, there's nothing unusual going on. And then all of a sudden, and this was quite surprising and a little disconcerting, I see 4 amber lights suddenly appear in a horizontal plane to my right front. So it'd be over towards, at that time I just passed, I think, the Picacho. I was headed towards Casa Grande. So this would have been looking over towards the East Valley, Coolidge, towards that area. And I was really fascinated by this. It was 4 amber lights in a perfect horizontal plane. I'm wondering what in the heck this is. So I start running through my mind. It's not airplanes because they don't have any running lights. And you know, any aircraft at night, except during wartime, is required to display running lights so that other aircraft can't see it. Wasn't aircraft, wasn't helicopters. My next thought was, okay, cell phone towers. But it wasn't cell phone towers. These lights were way up in the air, and they also did not have, as cell phone towers do at night, a blinking light on it, so airplanes and other things don't run into them. So I'm just mystified by what these lights are that I'm seeing. And I'm trying to look at them and figure it out. And I'm running through all the possible things that it could be. And at the same time, I'm driving 75 miles an hour on Interstate 10. So I'm keeping an eye on the road. These lights did not move at all, or they moved so slowly I couldn't detect them moving in my moving car. And they continued to be out there. And as I continued driving, the lights were all the way over to my right side, and then in my right rear, I couldn't see them anymore. It was fascinating. It wasn't frightening, but it was like, what in the heck is this? Next morning, I checked in the newspaper to see if there was anything unusual, and there wasn't. So I just kind of filed it away in my brain about something very, very unusual that I'd never seen. And I'd also like to add that I have experience in the U.S. Army as a field artillery forward observer, shot under flares at night, spent a lot of time outside. I know what things look like at night, aircraft and other things in the sky. So I'm fairly familiar with military aircraft, fixed wing aircraft, rotary wing aircraft, jets, propellers, whatever. So I filed this away in my brain. And then a couple of months later, the Phoenix Lights incident took place. That was March 1997. And I'm sure you all remember that, who lived here, or those of you who have had any interest in UFOs at all. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but it didn't seem to have any connection with what I saw. And then about 2011, I saw this book. And this is The Phoenix Lights. It was written by Lynn Kitay, medical doctor in Phoenix, and her husband. And if you look, there are 3 amber lights. And I thought, when I saw the cover of this book, that's exactly what I saw. So I picked this book up and found out that this woman had been videotaping the exact same phenomena that I observed in Phoenix for a couple of years and photographing them. So that piqued my interest, and I started reading more about this topic. And the more I read about it, the more interesting it got, because credible people are seeing some pretty incredible things in the sky and sometimes on the ground. So I'd like to take you through what I think are some of the most interesting cases of UFO sightings that have taken place around the world, and the reason why I think there should be an international scientific study. So UFOs are objects in the sky that an observer can't reasonably identify. They're also being referred to as unidentified aerial phenomena because some of them have no flight characteristics. The ones I saw weren't flying. They were just stationary in the sky. So they would more fit into a UAP category than UFO. UFOs sort of become a topic of in a expression of derision too. So UAP or UFO, but we know that a number of them have been seen. There have been tens of thousands of reports made of unidentified flying objects, and that some have been reported to have landed on Earth and had interaction either through its occupants or through the object with human beings. Now, this is what has been reported. The photograph you see there is of a Costa Rican geodetic survey aircraft that was doing some photography for map making, and just inadvertently took this photo. And in the photo on the right, you can see a flying saucer. So to be realistic about it, most of the things that we see in the sky that we don't understand have a good explanation. Whether it's a test of an ICBM at Vandenberg Air Force Base, whether it's a sundog, whether it's the planet Venus, or contrails or reflections, that there's just most of the things that we look at in the sky that we think we can't identify have a prosaic, mundane explanation. That's just the long and the short of it. Some of these sightings, though, can't be explained by conventional means. There's just like what I saw in January 1997. I still don't know what it is, and I sure as heck would like to know. And these are the ones, these cases that reasonable people, credible people have made these sightings, either close up, sometimes with cameras, sometimes with video recorders. These are the ones I think that merit scientific study. And these are the characteristics of the unexplainable ones. Ability to hover for extended periods, or to stay stationary, and to appear or disappear instantaneously. Like what I saw just suddenly appeared. It wasn't there, and then it was. And it stayed in the same place, or appeared to stay in the same place for a long time. Extreme maneuverability and speed far beyond the capability of conventional aircraft. Credible witnesses, military pilots, airline pilots, security police in the Air Force, and a lot of other folks have seen these objects, radar operators, flying thousands of miles an hour in the atmosphere, making 90-degree turns that would destroy a conventional aircraft and turn its occupants into red spray. So they can do things, they've been seen to do things that no aircraft that we have is able to do. An ability to interfere with aircraft missile systems, sensors, and other electronics. And we're going to see some examples of how this has happened, both to American pilots and also to pilots in foreign countries. The propulsion systems are usually silent and can't be seen, can't be detected. There's no jet engines, there's no propellers, there's no system that we would attribute to propel a vehicle through the air. They come in various sizes and shapes, configurations, and colors. Most of the time, they have no external surface features such as rudders, ailerons, wings, the things that we would usually attribute to an aircraft. This illustration on the left I got out of a national investigation Committee for Aerial Phenomena, where a field investigator went out to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, which is SAC headquarters, and did a report in September 1958. They like American Air Force bases. They're nothing new. You can go back to the Bible and find references to strange things in the sky. Ezekiel saw the wheel. This is a broadsheet that was done of a 1561 mass UFO sighting over Nuremberg, Germany. They've been reported and described as airships back in the 19th and early 20th century before heavier than air aircraft were flying in our skies. World War II is really where they started picking up, and pilots on both sides, both the Axis pilots and the Allied pilots, started seeing circular objects and other shapes flying through their formations of bombers and fighters. Didn't know what they were. The Americans called them Foo Fighters, and we thought they were the Germans, and the Germans thought that they were Americans. And although these things were periodically seen, there were no harm attributed to them. This particular illustration was at the UFO Museum in Roswell. It shows German military personnel servicing a flying saucer. It looks like they're loading it with hydrocarbon fuel, which doesn't really make sense. But anyway, it's this is when we started seeing UFOs in large numbers, was during World War II. Right after World War II, the number of UFO sightings slacked off, but 1947 was really when the dam burst, and the first rash of sightings that took place in the United States and all around the world seems to have been attributed to, or around the time that Kenneth Arnold, and he's the pilot right there on the wing of his private aircraft, was flying a search and rescue mission in the mountains in Washington looking for a downed Marine Corps transport plane when he saw 9 disc-shaped objects flying across the sky. He said the way he described them, they were skipping across the sky like saucers. So that's where the term flying saucers came from. And right around the time when Arnold's sighting was made, we started seeing sighting reports coming in from all over the country. And the media immediately picked up on the term flying saucers. Just days after Kenneth Arnold made his sighting, Roswell Army Air Force Base, which is still there, it's not being used by the Air Force anymore, but the base is still there, reported that they had found a disc on a sheep ranch about 60 miles north of Roswell near Corona, New Mexico. A sheep rancher named Mac Brazil, who was played in the movie Roswell, which was filmed here in Bisbee in 1994, reported that he found extensive field of crash debris. The Air Force sent Captain Jesse Marcel. He was intelligence officer for the 509th Strategic Bombardment Group, which is the same Air Force unit that dropped the bombs on Japan, and now was the only atomic bomb equipped military unit in the world, stationed at Roswell Air Force Base. Jesse Marcel went up to the site with the rancher, took a Jeep and a trailer, recovered a large amount of debris, and took it back to the base. The base commander was ordered to take the debris and Jesse Marcel to Dallas, Texas, to 8th Air Force headquarters and report. This story went all over the world for about half a day. So as soon as the wire service got it, it went everywhere. But a day later, the Air Force changed their story completely. And this is Captain Jesse Marcel in Dallas, Texas, posing for photographers with the debris from a weather balloon. So this experienced officer, this intelligence officer for the only nuclear-equipped bomber unit in the United States or the world, was unable to tell the difference between a crashed alien spacecraft and a weather balloon. The media accepted the explanation, and the Roswell incident just immediately dropped from public view. And as a matter of fact, when NICAP put out its roundup of saucer sightings over the years, and they listed the ones in 1947. Roswell wasn't in there. It was considered to be a non-event. And then later on, many, many years later, Jesse Marcel and a number of other witnesses came forward and said this story was bogus. He said he was ordered by General Ramey, who was one of the, I think, commanding officer of the 8th Air Force at the time, to go through with posing in front of the debris and saying it was only a weather balloon. So there were witnesses that now say that the story about it being a weather balloon was a cover-up, and both Jesse Marcel and his son, who was an Army Reservist medical doctor, said they saw the debris, it definitely wasn't man-made, and the whole story was bogus. Same year, Air Force General Nathan Twining, who was the commander of the Air Material Command, which was part of it was the Foreign Technologies Division, to which this debris was sent for analysis, wrote a memo. And he said these things were something real, not visionary or fictitious. This is a 4-star general. They weren't produced by weather or astronomical effects, and he called for further studies of UFOs. He changed his tune in the 1950s when he was Chief of Staff of the Air Force. But it's interesting to see, early on, Air Force was very much interested in these objects, were considering them to be a real phenomena and needed to be studied. So they started a project in 1947 called Project Sane, where officers would be tasked to investigate sightings and write reports and file them away. And Project Sane became Project Grudge in 1949, and then Project Blue Book, which if you've done any study of UFOs at all, you know what that means, in 1952. And this gentleman over here is Edward Ruppelt, who was one of the original officers in command of the Project Blue Book team. And Captain Ruppelt was very open-minded about the topic, and as time went on, became fairly convinced that these things were a legitimate source of interest. Project Blue Book, though, over the course of time, became more and more skeptical in terms of the slant that it took and the slant that its public affairs officers took in terms of UFOs. And it was finally terminated after an Air Force paid the University of Colorado for the Condon Report in the 1960s that said there was no scientific interest in UFOs. And that was the reason why Blue Book was terminated. There was no threat to national security and no evidence that UFOs were of extraterrestrial origin. Now, a lot of the folks that have looked in Blue Book files, including J. Allen Hynek, their contracted scientific advisor, and Dr. James E. McDonald of the University of Arizona, said that their methodology was slipshod and they did not follow scientific method at all as far as how they analyzed this thing. So there are people that believe that they closed the files for a legitimate reason. There are others who believe that these files were closed simply because the Air Force did not want the public to know about what was going on. So let's take a look at some of the things that people have seen and some of the evidence of UFO sightings. There are several different forms of evidence. One is visual sightings by credible observers. Another is photography. Another is radar tracks. Another is physical evidence left on the ground. And now cell phones and other methods of recording things. So as time goes on, we have more and more physical evidence that these things exist. What we don't have, what we can't see today, what I have never seen, and I'm sure nobody here has ever seen, is a UFO sitting out in front of you that you could look at, touch, climb on, and say, yes, this is an alien spacecraft. But we have photos such as this one that was taken by a farmer in McMinnville, Oregon, that's in West Oregon, whose wife observed a flying disc in the sky above their farm, called for her husband, said, Paul, go get the camera. He got his camera and managed to shoot 2 photos of this. The negatives appear to be intact. There wasn't any photo doctoring that was done that anybody could determine having looked at negatives. And these folks didn't make a dime off this. So they really had no motive for lying about it or making up a story. They continued to insist until they died that this thing was real and that it just zoomed off at an incredible speed after Paul Trent shot the photos. That was 1950. And in 1952, now these are just highlights. These are interesting cases, and there were lots and lots of other reports coming in, both easily explainable and those that couldn't be explained. But these are the ones that I considered to be some of the most important salient sightings. July 1952 was a huge event because a number of objects were sighted by interceptor pilots over Washington, D.C., which is restricted airspace, over the Capitol and the White House. They were detected on radar from Washington National, and F-94 jets were sent up to intercept these objects, which were visually sighted by the pilots, who were unable to overtake them. The Air Force described them as temperature versions and meteors. Or maybe they weren't, is the way they put it. Pretty soon after this, the Robertson panel was convened, and this was a panel of scientists led by Dr. Robinson, who is seen there with his pipe. They were briefed on UFOs by military and civilian intelligence sources. And after looking at the evidence that they were given, they concluded that the phenomenon wasn't a threat to national security, except the possibility of public hysteria. So they recommended a program to reassure the American public that whatever they saw in the sky were not extraterrestrial in origin, did not pose a threat to national security. And one of the things that I think we should look at is the Air Force's role in this. Their primary role is to defend the space above our country from foreign attack. So for them to admit there are things flying around in our airspace that we have no control over, it's something that a branch of the military would probably be reluctant to do. In 1953, the Air Force made sure that none of their employees, none of their enlisted men or officers were going to talk about the subject, because they issued Air Force Regulation 202, which said base commanders can only disclose sightings if the objects were identifiable as a familiar or known object. It was a weather balloon, or it was a KC-97 tanker that had its lights on and was flying over the base, or it was the planet Venus. So if it was regularly, easily explainable, they would release the information about it. The only people that were allowed to talk about this were PIOs from the Office of Information Services. And they would issue it's under investigation. If it was a really solid sighting, what they would say is it's under investigation, then just let it drop. If you're as old as I am, I'm sure you can remember the Mercury astronauts, the original 7. This is one of them. Leroy Gordon Cooper Gordo was his nickname, and he was the right stuff. He would join the Air Force in 1950, 1951. He was flying jets in West Germany when he observed a formation of UFOs. He and other pilots flew off to intercept them, weren't able to do so. So he made a solid UFO sighting in 1951. 1957, he was a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base before he was hired by NASA to be an astronaut. And he was in charge of a project to develop a dry lake bed, of which there are a lot in Southern California, as a landing site for fighter planes. And a film crew was out on one of those lake beds, or Air Force personnel with a movie camera anyway, when a UFO hovered over the lake bed, landed. They went up to it, took film of it, and then it took off and disappeared. They took the film to Cooper. Cooper looked at the film and saw what was going on as far as the UFO landing and taking off again. He was ordered to send the film to Washington, and that was the last of it. If you go to YouTube and just Google Gordon Cooper and UFOs, you're going to get an earful, because this man, who was probably one of the people who has been screened more physically and psychologically than any other human being in existence, because that was the original 7 Mercury astronauts went through incredible testing and screening. This is the man who still holds the record for American solo flight hours in outer space. He spent 22 orbits on 1963 on Faith 7, the Mercury mission, day and a half in space by himself. This man is convinced that the things he saw in 1951 and the things that he observed on film in 1957 were extraterrestrial in nature. So I'd say that's a pretty solid witness right there. This is Dr. James E. McDonald. He was an atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona. He was one of the top atmospheric scientists in the world. This is the man that had the curiosity to try to figure out, what does a raindrop look like? And what he determined was it looks like the top half of a hamburger bun instead of a conventional teardrop. He had a burning curiosity, solid scientific mind, and in the mid-1950s made a UFO sighting in Tucson. It got him interested, piqued his interest, and so he started studying the phenomena. He talked the Air Force into letting him have access to the Project Blue Book files, which amazed him that there were so many solid sightings that hadn't been reported to the public and that their methodology was so poor. He also criticized the methodology, the scientific methodology of the Condon Report, which we'll take a look at, the scientific report that was commissioned by the Air Force in 1966. Now, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, if you came out as a strong advocate for studying the phenomena of unidentified flying objects, you were labeled as a kook. And debunkers attacked him personally. They attacked his academic credentials. They asked the University of Arizona president to fire him and managed to get his funding eliminated for research projects. And in 1971, he committed suicide in Tucson. This is one of the most interesting UFO cases of all for one important reason. It was picked up by 3 senses, by human eyeballs, by radar, and also by electronic tracking devices. This is a RB-47. B-47, if you'd lived in Tucson in the late 50s and early 60s, you would have seen these flying in and out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base on a regular basis. It's a 6-engine, all-jet bomber, first jet bomber ever produced. And it was designed to fly to the Soviet Union, to China, and to other countries in the Warsaw Pact, wherever the Air Force sent it, and drop hydrogen bombs on military installations, industrial targets, whatever they were assigned to drop bombs on, hydrogen bombs. Some of these bombers, instead of carrying nuclear weapons, had the bomb bays outfitted with electronic sensing equipment with a 3-man crew that would man those devices. And these aircraft and the men were called Ravens. They operated out of a Strategic Air Command base in Wichita, Kansas, and their main purpose was to probe Soviet air defenses. So they would fly right up to the border, the airspace in the Soviet Union where their borders began, and try to get the Russians to react, which is a pretty dangerous job. One of these planes was flying along the Gulf Coast of the United States in September 1957 on a training mission. They were practicing what they would call tickling air defenses, which was to enter their airspace, try to get the bad guys to turn on their radar so you could determine frequency bandwidth of radar systems and where they're located so you could figure out how your airplanes could penetrate Soviet airspace. So this thing's flying along the Gulf Coast and simulating, gathering electronic data, when all of a sudden a UFO appears. The air crew, the pilot and the co-pilot, observed this UFO, and when they would make a turn, it would turn with them. So it just basically tracked them for an hour. While they were watching this UFO as they were flying along, it was also being tracked on ground radar by Air Force radar operators. And remember, this airplane carried electronic sensory devices. the crew that was inside the bomb bay monitoring those that electronic equipment started scanning all the frequencies, and they picked up electronic emanations from this UFO. So it was picked up both on the electronic sensing equipment, the radar equipment on the ground, and by an air crew that had no reason to lie about this. This case took place in 1964 in Socorro, New Mexico. This was Officer Lonnie Zamora, who was investigating a reckless driver when he heard a roaring noise and a loud flame in the sky. He drove over to where he saw this and saw an object, white shiny object in an arroyo. He thought it was a car that had turned upside down. He also observed two small people dressed in white coveralls near it, and as he got close to it, they became startled. They saw him and appeared startled, and by the time he got close enough to get out of his car, this thing had started its engine and taken off and hovered and then took off in the sky. What was interesting about this case, the Air Force investigated, and this is him standing there while the Air Force investigators were looking at the site. There were scorch marks on the ground, the vegetation and the earth had been scorched by intense fire. There were 4 indentations where there were evidently landing gear, and there were very tiny footprints. So this was another case where a very credible witness had observed something and the Air Force took it seriously. This was a case of a county highway engineer in Orange County, California, who was out doing what county employees do. He had a Polaroid camera with him and he was taking pictures of the right-of-way to make sure that the right-of-way was legal and safe. So he stops along the highway and he sees this above his truck. He grabs his Polaroid camera, he gets 3 shots of it. He got a 4th shot after it disappeared and it left what looked like a smoke ring. Well, Polaroid film is interesting because it's developed right on the spot. It's not done in a studio. It's not done by anybody. It's developed inside the camera. And they're very, very hard to it's very, very hard to fake a Polaroid. So these photos here are pretty good evidence that there was something in the air above Rex Heflin's pickup truck in Southern California. Michigan, in 1966, Ann Arbor, Michigan, there was a rash of UFO sightings around Ann Arbor, and one night a dorm full of college girls saw UFOs around their dormitory. Lights and objects. J. Allen Hynek, who is the scientific advisor for Project Blue Book, came to investigate and at a press conference said his opinion was that it was probably swamp gas. This elicited a very negative response from the community, particularly from the college girls that said this thing was flying over a lawn. Lawns do not exude methane. It wasn't swamp gas. This also caused Gerald Ford, who was a congressman in Michigan at that time, Republican leader in the House, to call for an investigation of UFOs. Hynek, who'd started working for Project Blue Book, actually started working for the Air Force with Project Grudge and Project Sign, was initially a skeptic. That's going to change. So that's J. Allen Hynek. And if you ever saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he's got a cameo role in that movie. He's also the person that came up with the classification of Close Encounters of the First through Fifth Kind. Dr. Hynek, over the course of his employment, went from being a skeptic to a believer that UFOs, unexplainable UFOs, may well have an extraterrestrial origin. Pretty fascinating how this happened. This is one of the most interesting cases. This is Robert Salas. Robert Salas was an Air Force Academy graduate, and in 1967, he was the Deputy Missile Combat Crew Commander for a Minuteman flight. And a Minuteman flight is solid fuel missiles that are arranged miles away from a central launch complex, which is buried 60 feet below the ground, much like the Titan missile site south of Green Valley, and then connected by cables over many miles to 10 Minuteman solid fuel missiles that these guys, if given the proper launch codes and authorizations, would send those missiles to the Soviet Union, where they would explode 30 minutes later and destroy a lot of stuff. So he's sitting down in the silo in a day in March 1967 when he gets a call from an Air Force security policeman. And again, if you'd lived in Tucson in the 1960s, when the Titan missiles were there in the 70s and 80s, you would have seen extended cab pickup trucks driven by Air Force security policemen cruising up and down the interstates and state highways, going out to patrol Titan missile bases. They did this also in Malmstrom Air Force Base up in Montana. They were responsible for the above ground security of the missile silos and the command center where at that time Lieutenant Salas was stationed. He gets a call and he says there's a UFO outside the perimeter, and he tells him, keep me posted. A couple minutes later, the air policeman or the security policeman calls back and said it's right over the gate, and he's terrified. And at that moment, all 10 of the missiles started going offline one by one. So what this means is that those missiles, which were ready to fire at a moment's notice, were no longer operable, 10 of them at a time. This had never happened before. An incident had happened earlier, Echo flight, where an estimated 6 missiles had gone down, but never entire flight. As a matter of fact, it was not common at all for missiles to go down, become inoperable. It was very uncommon for 2 of them to become operable at a single time. And for all 10 to suddenly go offline had never been heard of. So the Air Force asked Boeing, which was the primary contractor for the Minuteman missile, and this is one right here, they asked them to investigate the incident, come up with a reason for why it happened, because this is significant to national security. If something can make all 10 missiles in a flight go offline, what would happen to the other 1,000 Minutemen? How could they be rendered inoperable as well? Boeing investigated it. They wrote a report. I read the report. It's online now. And they said, we cannot replicate it. We don't know how it happened. Robert Salas believes he says they were trying to send us a message that we should not be messing with nuclear weapons. 1966, the Air Force funded a study at the University of Colorado. This is Dr. Edward Condon. And UC Colorado Boulder got $600,000 to do a scientific study of the UFO phenomena. And a lot of folks got excited about this. They thought this is great. Scientists are finally going to do something to look at this realistically. And after a 2-year study, the report was released. Dr. Condon wrote the conclusion, which was put in the front of the book instead of the back of the book, and said that there was absolutely no reason to study, no scientific reason to study UFOs, that there was no evidence that there was any use in studying these, that these things were natural phenomena, had prosaic explanations. The interesting thing about Dr. Condon and one of the other folks who worked on this report, Robert Lowe, was that both of them had made comments before the project was really underway, before the project was concluded, that this whole thing, they knew ahead of time what their conclusion was going to be. So the head of the Condon committee and the man that wrote the conclusion to the report had decided before the report was written, before all the evidence was examined, that UFOs were not real. So a lot of criticism was levied at the Condon report. There were also a lot of folks that said, well, case closed, and academics basically dropped UFOs as any kind of subject for serious study. Interesting thing is, a lot of the reports that are in there, the UFO reports that are in the Condon report, if you can pick up the book secondhand, unexplainable. So in a way, Dr. Condon's conclusion does not match the evidence that's in the book and in the report itself. This is one of the most interesting UFO cases. This took place up on the Mogollon Rim. This is Travis Walton at a UFO convention. He spoke in Phoenix on Saturday. I was hoping to get up to see him, but that didn't work out. He was on a brush clearing crew in 1975, working up near Springerville. And when they finished their work and they were heading back to town, there were 6 of them in a pickup truck, and they saw what looked like might be a fire nearby. So they drove over to investigate it. And when they got to a clearing, they saw a large disc-shaped object hovering above the clearing. And Travis got out of the truck to look at the object. And as he did, he was struck by a beam of light, which hurled him to the ground and caused the other 5 men to flee in terror, which is probably a good response. And after a short time, one of them decided to go back. And when he got back to the site, Travis was gone. So these guys had to drive to Springerville and explain to the local authorities that their friend had been zapped by a light emanating from a flying saucer. And when they got back, he was gone. Well, the natural assumption by law enforcement authorities were these guys are making up a BS story because they killed him. So that was what was believed for several days. The 5 men took polygraph tests. 4 of them passed with flying colors. The other had inconclusive responses. But a few days later, Travis Walton shows up buck naked outside of a gas station near Heber, Arizona. And the story came out eventually that he said he was abducted, that he was taken on board a UFO, studied physically, and then returned to Earth. He stuck to this story. All 6 of them have taken polygraph tests several times, and all 6 of them have passed the tests. So you've got 6 people telling the same story, have stuck to the same story for 45 years, and have passed polygraph tests. This was a case that took place in Iran in 1976. This is Major Parvez Jafari, who retired as an Iranian Air Force general. And when a UFO appeared over Tehran, Iran, and Iran was still under the Shah of Iran and a U.S. ally, and so they were flying U.S. aircraft. 2 aircraft were dispatched to intercept it, and both aircraft, including the one that he was flying, when they tried to close with the UFO, experienced radar failure, as the ground radar did, and also experienced failure of their other electronic systems. And when you're flying an airplane at night and your radar fails, you're essentially blind. And his weapon systems failed. As soon as they turned away, the systems returned to normal. General Jafari and some of the other folks that you're seeing in this presentation testified at the National Press Club in 2007 in Washington, D.C. to what they had seen during their experiences. These 2 men, this is Colonel Charles Halt, U.S. Air Force retired, and Tech Sergeant James Peniston, U.S. Air Force retired, were unwitting participants in a major UFO event in December 1980. On the night of December 25th and 26th, Jim Peniston was sent out off of RAF Bentwaters, which was a big U.S. Air Force base in Anglia, England, that was the largest tactical Air Force unit in Europe and was also the storage location for a large number of nuclear weapons that would be used in the event that the United States and Russia went to war. So Jim Peniston was sent off base to investigate a glow in the forest. He said, and he was told by the security policeman that sent him out there, something landed out there, didn't crash. Security team went out and looked at the object. They found a 6 foot tall by 9 feet wide object sitting on the forest floor. They examined it. It emanated electromagnetic radiation of some sort that made the hair on their arm stand up and also seemed to cause some distortion of their senses. Peniston sketched it, and they took photos. Photos didn't come out, or when he turned it in, he never saw the photographs. But he and several other members of the Air Force Security Police team went out there, said, we saw a UFO landed in the forest. It all of a sudden took off and left the scene at a high rate of speed. On the night of 28th and 29th December, Colonel Halt was called out of a Christmas party to investigate another UFO sighting in Rendlesham Forest. And this time, he and a group of Air Force security policemen observed numerous UFOs in the sky, another object traveling through the forest, and one of those objects shot a beam of light down at their feet. And he wrote a memo about it. He also recorded his experiences while this was going on, and you can find websites where you can listen to his voice recording of the night that he encountered a UFO in Rendlesham Forest. Both these men appeared at that press conference in 2007. They've told this story numerous times. He became a member of the Inspector General's office for the U.S. Air Force, and the report that he wrote on his encounter did not affect his career in any way, shape, or form. This is Admiral Lord Peter Hill Norton, who was the British equivalent of their Secretary of the Navy, British equivalent of the Chief of Naval Operations, and British equivalent of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And what he said was very interesting. He said either this event happened or it didn't. If it did happen, then it's of intense interest to us to know about it. And if it didn't happen, it's of intense interest to know about it, because that meant that the deputy base commander of a large American Air Force base that was stockpiled with nuclear weapons, and his men are hallucinating. So he said it was either or. And he believed that it happened. And he also advocated for a study of UFOs. This is an incident that took place in 1986. This is Kenju Terauchi, who had 20,000 hours flight time at the time of the incident. He was a very, very experienced pilot, started in the Japanese Air Force flying fighter planes, joined Japanese Airlines. And in the night that this particular incident happened, he was flying from Japan over the polar route to Paris, France with a cargo. This was a cargo 747, not a passenger plane, so it was loaded with cargo. When he got near Alaska, all of a sudden a giant UFO appeared off of his aircraft. And you can hear the voice recordings if you look for them. They're on the internet, where he's asking Anchorage Air Traffic Control if they have any traffic in his area. And they said, we've got an object. And they said, there's something the size of an aircraft carrier outside my airplane. This object tracked his aircraft for a period of time. It was picked up on radar, both military and civilian radar. And he was grounded by Japan Airlines for 2 years for making this report because it embarrassed the company. The data was later confiscated, and the data was on green bars. If you remember computer paper, the green bar paper from the 1970s and 80s, that's how the tracking data was recorded. And the voice recordings were also maintained. And this gentleman right here, John Callahan, was the safety inspector who was tasked with checking this incident out. Now, this is a man who ordinarily would investigate airline crashes, go out and figure out what caused it, make sure it never happened again. So he's a very trusted and responsible person. He investigates this incident. He looks at the radar tracking data. He correlates it with the voice recordings that were made between the air traffic controller and the pilot. And he reports it to Admiral Bobby Inman, who is the head of the FAA, Federal Aviation Agency at that time, who sets up a meeting with President Reagan's science advisors that is also attended by some CIA agents who tell Mr. Callahan that this event never happened and don't talk about it, and confiscated the radar tracking on the green bar papers and also the flight recordings. Well, Mr. Callahan had made copies of both of these things and kept them until he retired, and then took them home with him, and he has been talking about this ever since. In '89 and 1990, thousands of people in Belgium saw triangular UFOs, enormous triangle-shaped UFOs flying over flying over Belgium. Belgium's a tiny country, and there were hundreds of sightings made by thousands of people. And the Belgian Belgian Air Force investigated this and said there is no explanation for what happened. The French government authorized a report. It's called the Cometa Report. And it was the result of a consortium of scientists, military people, who got together and did a serious study on all the sightings that were made, but not just in France, but in other countries in Europe and the United States. And their conclusion was that the least unlikely hypothesis, and this was couched very, very cautiously, the least likely hypothesis was that these objects were extraterrestrial. The least unlikely hypothesis. Then March 1997, something starting in the Bradshaw Mountains and possibly further up north traveled south across Phoenix and was seen by thousands of people. And it was seen both as a solid object and as lights, known as the Phoenix Lights. Within a short period of time, Governor Fife Symington held a press conference where he had his chief of staff dress up in an alien costume. And it was his way of trying to lighten the tension. Apparently, he was worried about a statewide panic. Now, what was interesting about this, while Governor Symington was making light overall about these sightings, he himself saw the object. Later on, came out and said, whatever it was much larger than any known aircraft, and it is not from this earth. And he hosted the 2007 National Press Club Conference in Washington, D.C., where all these other fellows spoke, including John Callahan and Parvez Jafari. This was a sighting in 2006 at O'Hare Airport, and it was seen by crewmen, ground crews that were servicing United Airlines aircraft that were up at the facility for the United Airlines. And if you can see this right here, that is a disc-shaped object hovering over O'Hare Field. Pilots saw it. There were pilots who were waiting to take off that heard the traffic over the radio, looked out the windows of their airplanes and saw a flying saucer. There were ground crews that saw it and a lot of United Airlines employees. All of a sudden, the object took off at high speeds and punched a hole in the sky, which airplanes don't do that. In 2004, Navy planes flying off the USS Nimitz were conducting a training exercise off the California coast, not far from Catalina Island. They were vectored in to intercept UFOs that were flying low over the ocean. And they got it on their video arrays. And so there is documentation what these planes did. There's also voice recordings of the pilots, and they're astounded. They chase one of these things and get a lock on it. This right here is what the pilot is aiming at. It's the center of his array, and that is the UFO right there. These objects were also tracked by some very, very sophisticated radar systems on the Navy ships that were escorting the Nimitz, and by AWACS airplanes, the tracking planes, airborne early warning planes that fly over the aircraft carrier to detect enemy aircraft. So it was visually sighted, and it was also tracked on radar by two different sensing systems, very sophisticated systems. Now, the Pentagon had supposedly closed the case on UFOs back in 1970 when Project Blue Book was declared finished. But unofficially, the Air Force was tracking all of the sightings that took place in places like Iran, in Belgium, and other places in the world, as well as in the United States. And in 2007, at the urging of Harry Reid, senator from Utah, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, launched the ATIP program, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, to study UFOs. So the Defense Department, DIA, had an active tracking program to look at these things. This is another photo right here of footage from one of those Navy fighters. That is an object that they were tracking that they had actually locked onto. As soon as they locked onto it, took off and vanished. So there's another program now called the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force in existence. So the military is studying these. They are now, the Navy at least, is releasing photographic and voice documentation of encounters with unidentified flying objects. So what should we do about these things? Are these all hoaxes? Are these all misidentifications? Are they all fantasies or people seeing things that they don't really see? Or is there legitimate reason to consider that some of these things might be a threat to military and commercial aviation, that they might be a threat to the national security of the United States, or that they might be perfectly benign, but from another planet or another galaxy or another dimension? So this is what, and this is my opinion, I think should be done. A nonpartisan international science commission, independently funded. So it's not beholden to the Air Force, it's not beholden to any government, to study this phenomena, get some of the top atmospheric scientists, physicists, astronomers in the world to look at this and see if they can come up with a conclusion. Declassify and release everything. And a lot of countries have already done this. The UK has declassified and released all their UFO reports and documents, and some pretty fascinating things came out of that. France has done that. I think a lot of countries have done it in Latin America now too. And then we need protocols, because right now commercial pilots are very reluctant to report these sightings, and they happen fairly regularly. There have been near misses between commercial aircraft and UFOs. There have been possible crashes between UFOs and commercial aircraft. So there needs to be a set of protocols, though, for all pilots, anybody that's flying in the air, and air traffic controllers too, what to do about these things. And treat them as friendly. They are not hostile. If they're hostile, we'd know by now. Another thing that people haven't really thought about is what kind of impact do UFO sightings have on the observers? So I'm thinking that it'd be a good idea, whether it's a police officer, whether it's a pilot, whether it's an air traffic control, whether it's just Joe citizen that has an encounter, to think about that and make sure that anybody that encounters one of these things has the opportunity to get treated for PTSD if they need to. So that's my presentation. My personal opinion is this is worthy of study. Are these things interplanetary spaceships? Maybe. Are they hallucinatory? Possibly some of them are. Are they optical illusions? Can they be explained by other means? Some of them possibly can. Is there a possibility that these things come from another planet, from another galaxy, from another dimension? Well, if we're the most intelligent creatures in the universe, oh, that doesn't say much. So that's my presentation. If anybody's got any comments, questions, observations, I'd be happy to hear.
Thank you, Mike. That was fantastic. Do you want to stop screen sharing?
Well, one thing I thought I might do real quick, if you're okay with that, is show some of the books that people might be interested in, because after all, this is a library presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Would love that. And also, do you want to mention the most recent U.S. government position? Was that just last year or 2018?
Well, yeah, they're definitely studying these things, and the U.S. Navy, more than the Air Force, is far more open to consider these things to be other than the mundane, prosaic sightings. Nobody's come out and said they're alien spacecraft or anything like that, but they are definitely far more willing to discuss this now than they were before.
And definitely unidentified, which is the United States government going from it didn't happen or it didn't exist and keeping it secret to saying these aren't ours, and working with other governments, we cannot identify them.
And hopefully now what we'll try to do is figure out what they are and to make sure that whatever our response is to them, that it's a friendly response. So this is the first book I'd like to recommend, and this is the one on the Phoenix Lights. And there's also a video that this Dr. Kate put out. She and her husband in their house up in the Phoenix slopes on the northeast side of the valley videotaped and photographed these little amber lights, the same type of lights that I saw 2 months before the Phoenix Lights. This is
Mike,
quite a
if
book.
you stop the screen share, then your video will come up larger.
Okay, I can do that. Okay,
And I'm typing the titles into the chat as well, and we'll check these.
this is by Georgina Bruin, and this is called You Can't Tell the People, and that was something that Margaret Thatcher told her. We couldn't tell the people about UFOs. This is the best book that I could find about the Rendlesham Forest encounter in 1980, where the 2 nights where Air Force security personnel left RAF Bentwaters and encountered some very strange things in the Rendlesham Forest. And it's a really good read. This one is called UFOs and Nukes. It's by Thomas Hastings. And what this is an exhaustive study of the tremendous interest that UFOs seem to have for military installations and aircraft and ships that have nuclear weapons in them or on board. What he has done is create a website where retired military personnel can go and communicate with him and tell him about their experiences. He has found hundreds of security policemen, of missileers, of pilots, of base personnel who have been willing to come out and talk about the incredible things that they've seen. Once military personnel are retired, the Air Force regulations aren't applied against them anymore, which is why Colonel Halt and Sergeant Peniston and a lot of other retired military personnel have been willing to share their experiences. This is probably the best book recently written. It's called UFOs, Generals, Pilots, and Government Officials Go on the Record. It's by New York Times reporter Leslie Kean. It's an extensive collection of firsthand accounts, including our former governor, J. 5 Symington, of their encounters with unidentified flying objects.
And if anybody here has had a unidentified flying object experience, you can use the reactions at the on the menu to just do a thumbs up. I'm just curious if anybody here has had that a personal experience.
All right, there it is.
Because,
This is a This is a biography of Dr. James E. McDonald and his efforts to try to convince the world that we needed a scientific or legitimate scientific study of the UFO. It's also a sad book because it does not have a happy ending. But he was a brilliant man who did a lot of good work, both in atmospheric science and studying UFOs. There's plenty of literature out there, but these are books where people have taken some time to compile evidence and they're not hysteria. I think they're good, legitimate reading material. So if you get a chance to read those. There's also the MUFON website, Mutual UFO Network, that you can go to and look at their collection of sightings as well. There's other organizations all around the world who are fascinated by this topic. I think it's important to remember, we don't know what these things are. There's no way to say. They're extraterrestrial spacecraft piloted by aliens. But there is one thing that we do know, is that Bisbee is at the center of all this. There are 3 reasons I say that. The first reason is, if you saw the Steven Spielberg movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, when the mothership lands at the base in Wyoming and all the folks that were abducted start climbing off, one of them reports he's from Bisbee, Arizona.
Oh, that's right.
In 1990, William Shatner came to Bisbee and made a movie using Lowell as the backdrop called Groom Lake, where southern Arizona, Cochise County, became Area 51. And the third reason is that in 1994, Showtime, which at that time was a streaming service or video service, made a movie called Roswell that was filmed. The downtown scenes for Roswell were filmed right here in downtown Bisbee. And the crash scene, which I came across driving to Nogales to go to work at Carpenter Middle School one morning, the crash scene was filmed right outside of Sonoyta.
And
So that's
we have those movies at the Copper Queen Library, and in fact, we have done our best to collect every movie filmed in Bisbee, Arizona, and put it under local in the collection. So those are available for checkout.
Yeah. So I want to thank you for listening to this. I hope I didn't bore you. I hope that this might have been useful for folks. And if it, there's probably people out there that know a whole lot more about this topic than I do, but I find it fascinating. And I'm hoping that sometime in my lifetime that we get the answer to what's out there.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Does anybody have any questions for Mike, Christine?
Oh, I just had a comment. I
Sure.
would like to thank you for the wonderful presentation and thank Allison for sending the reminder, because I turned on the computer right at 5:30 and saw the reminder about the program. My husband studied UFOs most of his life. He spent 5 days a year at the international UFO conventions. So when he came home, I would hear about Travis Walton and most of the people you've mentioned today. And he was lucky enough to hear many of them as speakers at the International UFO Convention.
Yeah, that sounds that. I mean, I was really looking forward to going to see Travis Walton this weekend. He was speaking at the Arizona History Museum up in Phoenix, and I thought, boy, that'd be a
Yes,
nice thing. To,
yes,
but it was only the first, I think, first 25 people to go in. There was social distancing and masking, so they were
yes.
letting a very select number in. I thought I'd love to talk to him because he's clung to this story for 45 years. Nobody's been able to shake it, and it just why would 6 people concoct that story and go through all the crap that they went through?
Definitely.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense.
Well, and I think the suicide of Professor McDonald really highlights how devastating and destructive it is to be gaslit and lied to by your government and to be
And,
silenced.
and your peers,
and your
because,
peers.
yeah, because it was scientists that attacked him and were some of the biggest debunkers. And yeah, this is a man who gave a lot to the world and ended up putting a pistol to his head. It's truly sad, and
And
that
it's
is
really,
the price.
yeah, it's really wonderful to be in a kind of new era of to not be so devastated personally and professionally, because how, you know, that is one of the things about both science but also personal experience, documenting personal experiences and trying to find the reason or the answer. So, you know, that's another thing that's fascinating.
And in a lot of other countries around the world, airline pilots and military personnel, when they report these things, nothing bad happens to them. But from almost the get-go in the United States, if you were a commercial airline pilot and you reported this, it was a black mark on your record. So air traffic controllers and commercial airline crews will just let these things pass, which means, first of all, that there's a piece of scientific information that's being ignored.
They're not
just basically,
documenting.
yeah, they're not documenting it. And the second thing is that these folks are dealing with a phenomena that is that could be dangerous for as far as airline safety is concerned, and people should be taking this thing seriously, if for no other reason than
Definitely.
if they're in the airspace and they're not flying a flight path and they're flying around at several thousand miles an hour, they could definitely be a threat to anyone that is up in an airplane. So yeah, we should take it seriously until there's legitimate reason not to.
Did anybody have a question for Mike? Or Butchie, did you want to share your personal experience?
Not really. It happened so long ago, and only recently I talked to some friends. I was on a camping trip through college in 1983, and we were in Colorado, and about 7 of us all saw the same thing, and it was much like the amber lights all in a row, and they would split into different directions. They would be moving slowly, and then 90 degrees split off, and suddenly one became 2. But at the same time, there was also alcohol. We were, 18 years old. So we all have mixed memories of what actually happened. But I find it fascinating. I haven't seen anything here in Arizona. I used to see things in Texas. But other than that, I mean, I was just kind of interested and fascinated as to what's developing here. So.
Yeah, and Colorado is a hot spot for UFO sightings in San Luis Valley. UFOs are regularly sighted up there. And in fact, there's a woman who built a UFO watchtower that we visited last year with the grandkids, as well as the alligator farm right down the road from there. But just about any place you go in the United States, you can find people that have seen these things. And as Butchie was pointing out, you're just out, out in the sticks with your friends, and suddenly there's a light show in front of you that you have no way to explain. So,
and because of light pollution, that's what's so fascinating about the Phoenix lights is that this occurred over a big city with a lot of light pollution. Same with Washington, D.C. And, well, actually that was in the 50s last light. But I've seen many things, but the most, the biggest experience was actually on a beach on the island of Bali in Indonesia, which had very minimal light pollution, although there were many other people on this beach that night. But first we saw all the smaller lights, 1, then 2, then 10, remarkable patterns of maneuvering, stopping, starting, clear, vast night sky, but then just almost materializing, like if you didn't see it and then you did, was this immense triangle of very clear light patterns, different colors, rows of them having a light pattern formation. I mean, very close encounters. And it was so massive. Everybody on that beach staring and pointing, pre-cell phone though there.
Yeah, that's unfortunate that something like that did get recorded.
I think it was 1998. But what was part of the conversation was just how big is this triangle? I mean, these tiny little flitting lights, they seemed just tiny, like butterflies, compared to this thing that could have been the size of a building or could have been the size of a city. It was massive. And also, how far away was it?
It's hard to tell at night, distances and heights, elevation. I learned things in the Army in terms of ways that you could determine distance, range and deflection, which is from left to right, and then up and down, and then the distance itself. And a trained observer, and MUFON has people that they train, and the other earlier UFO organizations did too, that went out and did scientific investigations. How high above the horizon was this object? How far did it move? What was the intensity of it? And did it look like a quarter being held out at arm's length? Did it look like a beach ball? To try to get people to be able to describe these things. It's really hard to do, though, if you don't have the photographic evidence or a video evidence, just by going off people's descriptions. But you brought out a good point, Allison, about light pollution, and people don't spend much time looking up at the sky usually in urban environments.
Yeah.
You're inside, there's planes flying all overhead all the time, helicopters. And so if something does show up in the sky, it's very possible that most people just aren't going to pay attention to it. And in my particular experience, I was just driving along and at the right place at the right time to see it. But how many times does something happen and people don't see it, aren't able to make the connection, and don't have the ability to focus on it and make some kinds of calculations as far as size, distance, height, and things like that, which are really hard to do under any circumstances.
Yeah, that training is very interesting. Well, we're very lucky that Bisbee is officially a dark skies city.
Yeah, sure.
For moving into the future and for just the pleasure of observing the Milky Way with your naked eye. That's a fascinating thing that I discovered when I moved here. And we have time for one more question or comment before we say goodnight.
I wanted
Candace?
to tell you a story.
Yes.
Sure.
So I posted in the chat box that the National UFO Resource Center, let's see, reporting.
Oh, yeah. I see it. Yes.
I made a report there in, so it was 2008. Lake Union and the lakes around Seattle are well known and cited. They're making the claim that they have more sightings in Washington state than anywhere. But on this reporting site, it's all civilian reportings. There's probably at least 50,000 sightings there by state. You can do it by date, by site, what have you. It might be interesting to all of you to check it out. And they do it by orb type, whether it's oval or flitting or light or something, right? Even by what was seen. But my sighting was something that was just stationary for a really long time, looking west over Lake Union, that probably didn't move for an hour. And it was before, you know, the drones came on the radar, like things that would just sit there for a long time. But a lot of the sites were saying that they were groups of lights that would fly, a lot like Allison was saying, like in a group of fluttering of like butterflies or something moving together as a collective, down swooping over the water, coming up. And the lakes somehow are attracting a lot of these light shows of these phenomenon. And everyone always questions whether it's Boeing, because Boeing's in Seattle making all these, you know, airplanes. So I don't know, maybe Mike, what do you think about Boeing being sort of the, you know, creator of the unknowns?
I think that these things are interested in us in terms of our species. We're probably an anthropological study. I also think that if there is such a thing as or such things as intelligent civilizations that are tens of thousands, millions of years ahead of us, that they have the capacity to do things that we can't do. They have the capacity to monitor. And I think they probably, since we discovered nuclear weapons in 1945, that their interest in us and space travel. And this is something that's really interesting. The Germans started experimenting with ballistic missiles in the 1940s. The United States and its allies developed nuclear weapons in the 1940s. And this is when UFO sightings intensified. Several of the men that were in my PowerPoint presentation, when asked what they thought it meant that these things were hovering around military installations and Navy bases, aircraft plants and things like that, their conclusion was they're trying to send us a message that we need to stop messing around with nuclear weapons. So that's something I tend to believe too, that they're concerned that we're a relatively young civilization, that we have just started knocking on the door as far as physics and technology is concerned, and that we have still great power to harm ourselves and, as time progresses, to harm other civilizations. So they're probably watching us. If these people or if these sentient beings really exist, they're probably watching us with great interest to make sure that we don't harm ourselves or anybody else in the process.
Well, I think that would be fantastic if those 10 missiles going offline was representative of that. It would be nice to know there was somebody else out there looking out for stopping that kind of destruction, for sure.
Yeah, because we're not capable at this stage in our development to do that for ourselves, evidently.
Yeah, so I'm going to
Yeah.
take a little, a heart and optimism on that note. And thank you all for joining us. I miss you all in person.
Really.
We all do at the library, but it is such a pleasure to see your faces, hear your voices, and participate with you. And Mike, as always, thank you so much for your in-depth research, your perspectives, and your knowledge, and sharing it with us here in Bisbee in the
Yeah,
Copper
well,
Queen Library.
Thank
it's
you.
it's hard not it's hard not to be interested in all the things that go on in the world, and it's hard not to be stimulated by all the interesting people and things going on in Bisbee.
Yeah, we are a lucky community. You guys are all
We are.
wonderful. So I will say goodnight, and thank you all
Good
for
night.
joining us.
Thank you.
Adios.
Good night, Mike.
Thank you.
May the force be with you.
Thank you.